Welcome back to the second day of the Merritt Sewalong. Today, in my opinion, is probably the most difficult day as we are going to tackle the collar, but nothing that we can't handle if we go step by step. Okay, now first up, let's go ahead and create the back pleat. And to do that, we are going to take those middle lines and we are going to pull those center middle lines towards the second set of lines that are on the outside. Go ahead and pin that and give it a nice press. And then we are going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to baste along the top edge 3/8 of an inch in from the edge so that we don't have to worry about unpicking that later. Okay, and once you are done, the finished pleat on the right side of the fabric is going to be just under 1.5 inches wide. So you might want to just kind of like measure that and make sure that you've done that correctly. Now go ahead and take your yoke pieces and decide which one you want to have as your main yoke piece and which one is going to be your yoke facing. It doesn't really matter. If you're using some kind of print, that might matter a little bit more. So go ahead and decide that. Take your main yoke and you are going to pin it along the top edge of your back with right sides touching. Now once that is all pinned, we're going to go over to our sewing machine and you're going to go ahead and stitch that at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, now once that is attached, go ahead and flip it over so that the wrong side of your back is facing up. Take your yoke facing and you are going to pin it along that same edge. The right side of the facing is going to be touching the wrong side of the back. Now once you have that all pinned, you're going to go over to your sewing machine and stitch it once again at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. You want to stitch right on top of the stitching that you made before. So I find it easiest to stitch with the main yoke facing up so that you can stitch right on top of the stitch line that you made before. Okay, this is what it should look like after that stitching. So you have the two yoke pieces and then the back sandwiched in the middle. You want to go ahead and trim or grade those seam allowances. It really kind of depends on your fabric, how thick that is. I don't like the back of my shirt to be too stiff, so I go ahead and I do trim that. If nothing else, just kind of trim down either the back and the middle. I think what I'm doing right here is I'm grading it. So I am trimming the facing down to about 1/4 of an inch and then the back seam allowance down to about 3/8 of an inch. And then I'm leaving my main yoke at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now go ahead and press those yokes both up and away from the back, making sure that everything is nice and even. Now you're going to let the yoke facing fall loose, and so take your main yoke and you're going to pin each front to its coordinating yoke shoulder, and you're going to do this with right sides touching. And then after they're pinned, we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch those at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, next we're going to do something called the burrito method for finishing our shoulder seams and the yoke so it has a nice clean finish on the inside. So you are going to take your front and your back and just roll them up really tightly together until you get to the yoke. And then you are going to take the yoke facing, pull it around that little rolled up front and back, and then you are going to pin it to the main yoke. So that front is going to be kind of sandwiched in the middle. The right side of the yoke facing is going to be touching the wrong side of both of those fronts. And then of course the main yoke is going to be on the other side. So we're going to go ahead and stitch through all of those layers at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now you want to stitch once again right on top of the other stitch line that you made. So I like to do this with the main yoke facing up so that I can just stitch right on top of that previous stitch line. You just need to be really careful that you don't accidentally catch the rolled up front and back in your stitching when you do this. This is obviously going to be a little bit more difficult with the dress view than the shirt views, but it is also possible. You just need to roll them nice and tight and be careful when you're sewing. The other little tip I would have is just make sure that everything is lined up really well at the shoulder, because if it is not, then you're gonna have some gaping on your yoke and it's not gonna look really nice and smooth. Okay, this is what it should look like now that it is all sewn up. We do wanna go ahead and grade those seam allowances at this time. So I just went ahead and trimmed the yoke facing to 1/4 of an inch, the front seam allowance to 3/8 of an inch, and then I left the seam allowance for the main yoke at 1/2 of an inch. This is of course optional, and you just kind of decide according to the bulk of your fabric how much you want to trim or grade off of these seams. Okay, now we're going to birth the shirt out, which means that we are going to go ahead and pull the front and the back out of the middle of these yokes here until everything is pulled nice and straight and that it is all right side out. So this is what it should look like now. This is the inside, and then this is the right side, and it gives, like I said, just like a really nice clean finish on those shoulder seams and the yoke. So go ahead and give everything a really nice press along the shoulder seams and the bottom of the yoke. And then we're going to do a couple lines of top stitching 1/4 of an inch into the yoke through all of the layers at the bottom of the yoke and then also at those shoulder seams. Okay, and this is what it should look like now. Go ahead and give it another press to kind of like set those stitches, give it a little steam, and then you can set this aside for now because we're gonna dive into the collar and the collar stand. Okay, so you're gonna take your 2 collar pieces. One is your main collar that has the interfacing on it. One is your collar facing, and you are gonna pin them right sides together along the sides and then the long top edge, all of the unnotched areas. And once that is pinned, we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch those sides and top with a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then you want to go ahead and trim down those seam allowances for sure. And especially you're going to do that pretty aggressively around those corners so that you can turn those right side out and get a nice point. I also like to take a little bit of the bulk around the sides and the top as well. And then once you have that all trimmed down, you are going to turn it right side out. You might want to go ahead and grab a point turner or some other kind of pointy or sharp object so that you can press that into the corners and really get a really nice sharp point. I also find that it's easiest to get a really good edge if I press those seam allowances open first and then press down on that edge once it's closed up. Okay, now once you are happy with the way that that looks, you are going to go over to your sewing machine and you are going to top stitch the side and top edges of 1/4 of an inch in from the finished edge. Keep in mind that the main collar is the one with the interfacing, so I like to stitch with the main collar up just so that that stitching looks as good as possible. Okay, now that the collar is done, we're going to attach the collar to the collar stand. So grab your collar stand facing, that is the one that does not have interfacing, and then you are going to pin the bottom of your collar to the top of the collar stand facing. Make sure that the collar facing, so the one without interfacing, is the side of the collar that is touching the collar stand facing, and it's going to be the right sides of both of those facings touching each other. Go ahead and match up the notches to pin it along that top edge, and then the ends of the collar are going to line up with the dot markings on the collar stand facing. And once that is all pinned, we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to baste along the top. You can go ahead and do that at a normal 1/2 inch. Okay, now that this is attached, we are going to grab our main collar stand, so the one with the interfacing, and we are going to fold up the bottom edge by the seam allowance, which is a 1/2 inch. Now I find that the easiest way to do this, since it is a slightly curved edge, is I just run a quick line of stitching. I do this at like just under a 1/2 inch or a scant 1/2 inch. That way, once I fold it, I can fold just past that stitching and make sure that you don't see that stitching on the right side of the collar stand. So go ahead and press that up by a 1/2 inch right along that bottom edge, and then you are going to take your main collar stand and you are going to pin it to the top edge of your collar. Be careful to make sure that you are matching the edges and the notches and the dots. Be very precise here. That will make the rest of this much easier. And then you are going to go over to your sewing machine and you are going to stitch around that top edge at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Be extra careful around those curves. That can be a little bit tricky to get right. If it's easier, you could always sketch it first so you have a line to kind of follow when you're stitching. What I also like to do is I just decrease my stitch length slightly just so that it's easier to get a smooth line around that tight curve. Okay, this is what it should look like once you're done stitching. And then now you are going to trim those seam allowances. You want to be pretty aggressive with your trimming here because it's such a small little area in the stand. You don't want there to be extra bulk, and especially around those little curved areas, you need to really trim those down so that they can turn nicely and press up nicely, and you have a nice pretty curve once it's turned right side out. Once this is all pressed, it's going to be time to attach the collar and the collar stand to the shirt. You're going to have the right side of the shirt facing up, and then you are going to attach the seam allowance of the collar stand facing to the neckline. So the right side of the collar stand facing is going to be touching the right side of the shirt. Now be extra careful here that the finished edge of the collar stand lines up with the finished edge of the front of the shirt or the front of that button placket. And then there is a notch for the shoulder seam, there's center back notches, and then of course the other shoulder seam, and then once again lining up the finished edge of the collar stand with the finished edge of that button front placket. And then there's also, of course, the center front notches there that you can also line up if you would like. And then we will go over to our sewing machine and we will stitch this at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once again, keeping the main collar stand free, you are just sewing the collar stand facing at this time. Now, one thing that I just want to note is that you are attaching a pretty straight collar stand to a very curved neckline, and that means that even though the stitch line is the same length, you might find that the raw edges don't match up. So it might feel at first like it's not going to match up or fit, but I assure you that the actual stitch lines do match up when you are sewing them. Okay, and this is what it should look like after you've stitched it. Now, these seam allowances, you might want to go ahead and trim them down a little bit since there's so much seam allowances going into this small little collar stand. What I like to do is I just trim the collar stand facing seam allowance in half just to reduce a little bit of bulk, and then I leave the neckline facing the same just so that I have enough seam allowance to really tuck up into the collar stand when I'm trying to finish it. And then grab your iron and you're going to press all of those seam allowances away from the main shirt and up and into the collar stand. Now you want to be pretty precise here, and what you want is you want that folded edge of the main collar stand to just barely cover the stitch line where the main shirt attached to the collar stand facing. Now, as we've talked about before, I like to use a glue stick for this, but you can of course also pin it. Just once again, just be really precise. This is going to make the stitching look much neater if everything is lined up really accurately. And then once you're happy with how that is pinned, we are going to edge stitch all the way around the collar stand, starting at center back and then stitching all the way around. Now I always stitch with the inside of my shirt facing up, which is also where the main collar stand is. The reason why I do that is on a button-up shirt, if you wear it open, like I do mostly at the top, the collar stand on the inside of the shirt is actually going to be the more visible one. So that is what is my main collar stand. But if you're someone who usually buttons up your shirt all the way to the top, then you might choose to do it the opposite way. Now, I'll be honest, I think stitching around these little curves is not very easy. I usually have to unpick it at least once and try it again before I'm happy with the way it looks. So be patient, go slow. It is not a bad idea to reduce your stitch length a teeny bit when you're doing the stitch, especially around those curved edges, so that the stitches are small enough that they can really make those turns. Okay, and this is what it should look like when it is done. As you can see, the main collar stand stitching looks pretty good. On the back, it looks decent. I got off a couple times, but I'm not going to worry too much about that. Okay, we're done for today. Tomorrow we'll come back. We'll jump right into sleeves. Let me know if you have any questions.